Let's start recording now.
You can record it and then place it, pass it on to the whole entire world to hear what I have to say tonight about the non-proliferation. I'm sure everybody will be interested. Fine. So we have 5 people who are in already, right? Out of
6 now.
6 out of 8, since the 9th one couldn't make it, right?
Correct. Yes.
Okay.
No, actually, it's
Actually, I'm going to stop. People who are late, well, then will join us. Anyway, good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining me tonight. Before we start, I'd like to put a question to you all. Would you be interested in going back to the in-person format for our spring talks that are scheduled, one in April and the other one in June? You'll be informed, obviously, of the dates, as usual, through the spring flyer. One of the talks will be on, actually they are very topical. One of them will be on China's bullying, trade bullying, and how to counter it. And the second one will be on the Saudi American relations. But anyway, so I like to ask you actually if you'd be ready to go back to our previous, pre-COVID format, meeting at the small library, some of you know, or you prefer the current online sessions. I don't need an answer right now. I'd like to just think about it and make your choice when you sign up for the next talk. As I said, one is in April, the second one is in June. Personally, I believe it would be nice and safe actually to see each other in person, since we are a limited group, and some of you are familiar with a small library. There is plenty of space there. But that's only my opinion, and I'll naturally defer to whatever decision you make. So now back to our. We have some noise on the line. It's better now. Now back to our subject. In the afternoon of February 27 of last year, Russian President Putin convened a group of.
Sorry, Pierre. You're muted. There Hello? You go, Pierre. Sorry, I muted everyone because there was so much noise on the line, yes. And I didn't realize I was muting you too.
Also, you muted. So, do I have to start all over, or you muted me from the beginning, or? Okay. Listen, if I was muted, I apologize, and I'll start all over again. It won't take long.
You asked about the question about whether people would like to be.
Was I muted or not?
No, it was right after that. Sorry.
Oh, okay then. Okay, fine. Then I'll start with our subject. In the afternoon of February 27 of last year, Russian President Putin convened a group of senior Kremlin officials to witness an extraordinary public statement. Putin announced that he had taken the unprecedented step of ordering Russia's nuclear warheads to be prepared for what he called special combat readiness. In doing so, he placed for the first time in a long time, the question of nuclear strategy and deterrence at the very center of world politics. Indeed, not since 1991 collapse of the Soviet Union has the fear of great power nuclear conflict played such a prominent role in international affairs. But first, let's see briefly how the American strategic thinking has evolved since the start of the nuclear age. Initially, that thinking was influenced by 3 decades of global conflict that had pulled a reluctant United States into 2 world wars. But based on that painful experience, Washington assumed that the totalitarian Soviet Union, born after World War II, which had much of Eastern Europe under its control, may be tempted one day to stage a surprise attack on the United States in its quest of global domination. Another component of American thinking at that time was that the devastation wreaked by World War II, the ensuing weakening of traditional powers, such as France and the UK, and the complete defeat of Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan had created massive power vacuums, vacuums from which the United States was separated by 2 oceans, but that the Soviet Union, which with the world's largest army and the benefit of proximity, could use to its advantage to seize more territories and build a Eurasian economic and industrial base that could pose eventually an existential threat to the United States. That prospect caused the United States to break with its traditional avoidance of foreign entanglements and offer instead peacetime protection to allies and former adversaries. This offer, however, ran into 2 key obstacles. First, Washington did not have any reasonable, cost-effective means of defending its allies with conventional military forces, short of constructing a garrison state and potentially bankrupting its own economy in the process. The other option was allowing allies to acquire their own nuclear weapons to deter an external attack. But it was considered just as undesirable and much riskier, since those allies could use the weapons in other circumstances, restricting Washington's freedom of decision and action, and even drawing US forces into avoidable regional conflicts. And in the case of Germany and Japan, ending up destabilizing Europe and Asia and provoking Soviet intervention. Now, for all those reasons, non-proliferation became a core tenet of post-war US grand strategy. Rather than supplying nuclear weapons to their allies, the United States reserved the right to resort to preemptive nuclear strikes against a potential Soviet Union, potential nuclear Soviet Union nuclear threat. However, the credibility of such a strategy came into question, especially that in the meantime, a revolution in satellite-based surveillance technology made a surprise attack on the United States highly improbable. With that in mind, Washington switched to a two-pronged nuclear strategy. On the one hand, it sought strategic stability through arms control with the Soviet Union based on mutual vulnerability and the removal of incentives for either side to use nuclear weapons. As evidenced by the signing of the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, or START, which was a bilateral accord between the United States and Russia, limiting the number of nuclear warheads and their delivery devices, and instituting inspections of each other nuclear sites. This START agreement was just suspended last year by Russia. What happened is that basically the inspections that allowed monitoring of each other's side as to the number of warheads each other side had deployed, they're allowed to deploy around 1,600 warheads, nuclear warheads each. Those inspections stopped when COVID-19 arrived. And at the end of the COVID, at the end of last year, more or less, or maybe beginning mid-2022, the Russians started using any pretext not to allow American inspectors to their nuclear sites. And this is when the American side also decided not to allow Russian inspectors anymore on the American side. So for all intents and purposes, this agreement was suspended, and only suspended. And there is still some hope that by the end of 2025 or 2026, when this START agreement, this version expires, a new agreement can be concluded between the two sides. Although, because of the war in Ukraine and the deterioration of relations between Russia and the United States, that possibility does not appear very likely. Now, on the other hand, this was one option used by, one strategy used by the United States, which was strategic stability. The other option, on the other hand, the US kept developing defensive strategies and weapons that would give it an elusive nuclear advantage in order to extend deterrence, limit proliferation, and pressure the Soviet Union. Case in point, the so-called Strategic Defense Initiative presented by President Reagan in the early 80s. This initiative that was referred to, some of you might remember, as Star Wars, read like science fiction. It was a system relying on space-based X-rays lasers that would detect and deflect any nukes headed towards the United States. Over the 10 years, and despite criticism from politicians and many scientists that the plan was impractical and unfeasible, actually, the government, the administration, spent up to $30 billion on developing it before that plan was scrapped by President Clinton in 1993. And yet, despite its far-fetched, expensive, and controversial nature, that strategy of trying to gain a nuclear advantage over the Soviet Union worked. NATO partners and other allies embraced it. curbing nuclear proliferation. And it affected the Soviet nuclear strategy as well, driving the Soviet leadership into an expensive arms race that exposed USSR structural weaknesses and helped accelerate the process that eventually led to the dissolution of the country. Looking back, it is difficult to say whether the US and its nuclear strategy at the time were ingenious or just lucky. Now, fast forwarding to today's wave of concern about the global nuclear order caused by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Or in other words, the invasion by a nuclear armed state, Russia, of its non-nuclear neighbor, Ukraine, threatening it to use nuclear weapons to win if necessary. Making matters worse, that neighbor, Ukraine, had agreed not to become a nuclear armed state, returning its arsenal of that it inherited from the Soviet Union at the time when Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union. At the end of the Cold War, they returned their arsenal, nuclear arsenal, to the Soviet Union, what became later Russia, in exchange precisely for security assurances from Russia, the United Kingdom, and United States. Russia's blatant violation of those assurances and its threats to use nuclear weapons against Ukraine as a way to end the war and deter outside intervention in Ukraine sent a powerful signal to non-nuclear states. Get nuclear weapons as fast as you can, lest you become the next Ukraine. That message prompted some US non-nuclear allies and partners to seek new assurances from Washington that its security commitments are still strong at a time when strained relations between great powers have made cooperation on non-proliferation far more difficult. But although Russia's invasion of Ukraine has created nuclear risks, the risk that it will set off a wave of nuclear proliferation is lower than many believe. For starters, Washington's non-nuclear allies want to remain under the US nuclear umbrella, aware that rushing to acquire nuclear weapons would carry significant risks, possibly provoking adversaries, triggering economic sanctions, and leading Washington to turn down its security guarantees. Also, the US can strengthen its partnerships with its allies through the so-called Civil Nuclear Assistance Program that the US used during the Cold War and which became more attractive in the wake of the war in Ukraine. The civil nuclear assistance consists in helping countries set up non-military nuclear facilities, such as commercial nuclear power plants. To be sure, the cost of underwriting nuclear energy projects is daunting, but the payoff is worth it. It allows Washington to retain control over the civil nuclear program of partner countries by ensuring that the technology is not used for nuclear weapons, and by threatening to end its assistance if an ally began a covered nuclear weapon program. It also offers the United States the possibility to counter China's and Russia's efforts to overtake the global civilian nuclear market. Indeed, between 2000 and 2020, 19 of the 33 commercial nuclear power plants worldwide were exported by those two authoritarian states. Not only has US influence diminished as a result, but proliferation risk may have increased as the controls that Russia and China exercise on foreign nuclear energy projects are often much looser than those required under US nuclear cooperation agreements, which in turn may encourage some savvy states to surreptitiously divert the civilian programs towards military purposes. Russia's invasion of Ukraine seems to have reversed that trend, at least for now, as the Kremlin has become the poster child for irresponsible civil nuclear stewardship when its forces shelled and then brutally occupied Ukraine's Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. Ariel, if you could put up, please, map number 1. I just want to show you.
Sure, just 1 second.
Yeah, just want to show you the Zaporozhye nuclear plant, which has, because of the bombing in that area and not to in the proximity of the plant itself, knocked out a couple of reactors. No, that's not it. Map number 1, please.
I'm so sorry, excuse me.
It's okay. Thank you. You can see Zaporozhye here in the Donbas region. And the fighting that has been taking place in that region, especially for the past 6 months, and the bombing of the plant, not of the plant itself, but the proximity, knocked out a couple of reactors at times, and knocked out also the energy it provides to parts of, anyway, this region of Ukraine, including Kherson, Mykolaiv, Dnipro, and other areas. Just to mention that Zaporozhye is the largest nuclear power plant in Europe. Now, Washington was quick to seize those opportunities, pouring additional resources into shoring up domestic nuclear fuel production, developing advanced reactors, and enhancing export competitiveness, most notably by providing grants from the US Trade and Development Agency to domestic firms that develop nuclear energy programs abroad. And the results were not long in coming. Just in the past 6 months, Romania, Sweden, and France signed agreements with US nuclear firms to build nuclear power plants in their countries. Poland selected Westinghouse to develop its first nuclear power plant. And Finland walked away from a deal with a Russian state-owned enterprise to build such a plant. Now, other US allies and partners, such as South Korea and Saudi Arabia, have pursued a different strategy of acquiring nuclear capabilities, a strategy known as hedging, that consists in developing their own capacity to build a nuclear device for ostensibly peaceful purposes, such as fueling nuclear power plants or managing radioactive waste, or even developing non-nuclear missiles of space launch capabilities that can later be modified for nuclear delivery systems. For those countries which are under constant pressure from potential nuclear armed neighbors, such as North Korea and Iran, such investments represent an insurance policy of sorts against aggression by adversaries or abandonment by allies. Since much of the same technology they use for peaceful purposes can be used to build nuclear weapons later if the security environment deteriorates. In the years ahead, the US will face a couple of crucial questions regarding nuclear weapons. First, what role, if any, will nuclear weapons play against smaller, hostile nuclear states, such as North Korea and possibly Iran? And second, should Washington respond if a great power uses nuclear weapons at a tactical level? For instance, if Russia detonates a small nuclear device for battlefield or demonstration purposes. In both scenarios, such scenarios, disabling a rogue regime's nuclear capabilities, like in North Korea, or responding to a tactical use of nuclear weapons by a great power like Russia or China, it would appear preferable to develop and deploy powerful conventional weapons whose use would be credible and compelling, rather than proclaim doctrines that are clearly untrue, such as calling for the use of nuclear weapons first, or even at all, save a nuclear attack on American homeland. Indeed, adversaries are much more likely to be deterred, and allies much more likely to be reassured by tools that Washington is likely to use, rather than empty threats. For instance, the demonstrated ability of the US to repel a Chinese amphibious assault on Taiwan, or a clear superiority in cyber operation, artificial intelligence, and space capabilities, would be more likely to reassure concerned allies and deter foes than nuclear counterforce systems that won't be used in the end anyway. And there are other reasons to doubt that Russia's war in Ukraine will lead to an uptick in nuclear proliferation. First, although fraught and uncertain, the current international political environment is paradoxically much less dangerous than in the early Cold War days. That might be a surprising statement, considering what's going on today. But you have to remember that today, unlike during the Cold War, neither China nor Russia are likely to dominate the Eurasian landmass the way the Soviet Union threatened to do in the mid-1990s. For the simple reason that over time, the cost of conquest have risen dramatically. For instance, it would be much more complicated for China or Russia to invade their influential and economically vibrant neighbors, which have impressive military potential and which have strong ties to the United States, which is the case today for the former communist states in Eastern Europe, and the number of China's neighbors, such as Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, and others, than the weak and submissive states those countries used to be during the Cold War. And even if they do invade, like in the case of Ukraine, Russia's military capabilities have been exposed as overrated. Second, although Russia's nuclear threats have been unusually explicit, this is not the first time that a nuclear power has threatened a relatively weak state. During the Cold War, West Germany feared a Soviet invasion, and Taiwan already feared an attack from communist China. At the time, both non-nuclear states considered even acquiring nuclear deterrents of their own, but ultimately abandoned their efforts. Nor is it the first time that a country has faced an existential attack after giving up its nuclear weapons program. Just remember that Saddam Hussein's Iraq and Muammar Gaddafi's Libya abandoned their nuclear weapons program, and both leaders were later deposed following Western military action. And yet, there is no evidence that either experience prompted other countries to seek military nuclear weapons, with the notable exception of North Korea, but that country's efforts to acquire a nuclear bomb predates Iraqi and Libyan leaders' demise. Third, history suggests that getting the bomb is easier said than done. Washington went to great lengths to prevent West Germany, Taiwan, and other states from going nuclear, using a mix of assurances and threats of abandonment if they persisted on the nuclear path. Middle Eastern countries have found it similarly difficult to acquire nuclear weapons, with the possible exception of Israel, which never publicly admitted being a nuclear power. Iraq and Syria had their programs derailed by Israeli and US attacks and sabotage, while Iran has endured 3 decades of sanctions and sabotage as it has progressed towards the weapon threshold. In short, the path to nuclear weapons status is littered with obstacles and risks, and that is unlikely to change after the war in Ukraine. Fourth, countries with allied protections are less vulnerable to external aggression than Ukraine, and therefore less likely to feel compelled to seek a nuclear deterrent. Unlike Ukraine, many countries that lie in the crosshairs of a potential nuclear armed aggressor fall under the protection of the US nuclear umbrella, such as Australia, Japan, South Korea, and most European countries, or have close security relationships with the United States, like Taiwan and several Gulf countries. US backing makes those countries far less tempting targets for aggression than Ukraine. It is no accident that Russia has refrained from deliberately attacking NATO member states, despite their substantial support for Ukraine's war efforts. In the Pacific region, the so-called AUKUS partnership between Australia, the UK, and the US, and this is map number 2, please, Ariel. Thank you. You see the 3 members of this alliance. AUKUS or UKUS stands for Australia, United Kingdom, and United States. You have Australia, United States, and United Kingdom. Offers another example of how Washington can solidify alliances, bolster allies' military capabilities, and set a positive non-proliferation precedent in the process. For instance, these 3 countries decided to build a dozen nuclear-propelled submarines. Now, there is a catch to that. The only non-nuclear country of the 3 is Australia. Obviously, the UK has is a nuclear power, and so is obviously the United States. But what happened with this alliance is that while giving or providing Australia with a deterrent, with a nuclear deterrent against China, for instance. At the same time, instead of just allowing Australia to develop its own nuclear military force, the alliance will provide these submarines, these nuclear submarines, which will be placed under joint command. In other words, Australia will not be allowed to use those submarines on its own. There will be a joint command that will make the decision whether or not to use them against a possible threat from China. The bottom line is that greater demand for US security backing gives Washington more leverage to attach non-proliferation strings to whatever assurances it provides. And finally, although Russia's violation of its security assurances to Ukraine and threats to use nuclear weapons have undermined the already strained nuclear non-proliferation treaty, which is the only binding arms limitation and disarmament agreement that entered into force in 1970 and was signed by 193 states. Those actions are unlikely to prompt an exodus from the agreement, partly for the reasons that I mentioned earlier. Most countries see little value in exiting the treaty and producing nuclear weapons of their own. Now, that being said, none of this means that Washington can declare victory when it comes to non-proliferation, as the risk that some US allies and partners may pursue the acquisition of nuclear weapons anyway, motivated by deepening concerns about US reliability amid the rise of powerful revanchist adversaries, diverging perspective between Washington and its allies, and growing worries in those countries about anti-alliance strains in US politics. And in a few particular cases, the US may even have to face reality and reconsider its non-proliferation policies, admitting that nuclear acquisition by democratic allies, such as Germany or Japan, would be far less threatening than during the Cold War, when it could have torn apart the Western alliance or provoked a Soviet attack. To be sure, a future world, which say a nuclear Australia or South Korea, would hardly be ideal for the United States, but it would be far worse for China or Russia. Well, in conclusion, the US military nuclear strategy in the years to come, rather than emphasizing an approach based on the superiority of preemptive nuclear strikes, will focus on maintaining to secure second strike survivability, which is a country's ability to respond to a nuclear attack with powerful nuclear retaliation against the attacker. Although a coordinated Chinese-Russian nuclear strategy, to say nothing of a combined nuclear attack, is highly improbable, it obviously makes sense for the US to prepare for such an unlikely scenario, if only as a form of insurance. At the same time, the Pentagon will continue to develop its conventional military capabilities, both quantitative and qualitative, especially of the weapon based on emerging technologies such as artificial intelligence, which, as I said earlier, are likely to shape strategic behavior in the years to come, both offering allies and partners security reassurances that would dissuade them from trying to acquire nuclear weapons, and deterring foes from contemplating a nuclear attack thus strengthening the non-proliferation regime worldwide. Before I give you the floor, I like to just to give you a couple of details about, and this is map number 3, please, Ariel, a couple of details of an example where the deterrence efforts by the United States were not successful. And this is a case of India and Pakistan. Now, India and Pakistan developed their nuclear military capabilities in the 70s. Today, they have similar arsenals, between 100 and 120 bombs. Both countries made similar pledges not to use the bomb first and not to use it at all against non-nuclear states. Neither country is signatory to the non-proliferation treaty that I mentioned earlier. Where they diverge is in the concept and the reason for acquiring nuclear weapons. For India, acquiring the bomb was more a question of prestige than security concern. It was a time when India was trying to get a permanent seat in the UN Security Council and considered itself as an emerging power, a big power in the world. So it was more a question of prestige than security concern, since New Delhi never really believed that nuclear weapons, and still does not believe that nuclear weapons would fail to deter an attack. And India relies mostly on its stockpile of conventional weapons that he gets mostly from Russia today, and where it has a distinct advantage over its neighbor. On the contrary, Pakistan, which does not have the stockpile of weapons, conventional weapons that India has, Pakistan sees the atomic weapon as a last resort deterrent against an attack from India, since its conventional forces, as I said, are inferior to India's. So this is so they developed their nuclear capacities in the 70s. And this is probably the only, not probably, but definitely, the only example where the US did not succeed. It is the same actually for North Korea, which also started developing its own bomb in the 70s, and today it is trying. It is known that North Korea now has a number of bombs, atomic bombs, but still has not acquired the capability of delivering that. And also, for your information, there are 9 nuclear states today in the world. 5 of them are the 5 members of the permanent members of the Security Council: the US, UK, France, Russia, and which is the 5th one? The UK, France, Russia, and the US. Some of them used to have a nuclear arsenal, but disassembled it, like South Africa. And some countries returned it, like, as I mentioned earlier, Ukraine, which has nuclear weapons on its soil when it was part of the Soviet Union, but also Kazakhstan and Belarus, which also had nuclear weapons on their soil and returned them to the Soviet Union when all these countries, ex-communist countries, became independent. So this is where we stand today. I do believe that in the years to come, the focus will be put on developing new weapons, conventional weapons, based on the latest advances in technology and on artificial intelligence, which will be probably much more dissuasive than the use of nuclear weapons. There is still a future for nuclear weapons, of course, but maybe less emphasis will be put on them in the future. And this is probably most of the American military efforts will go in the years to come. So now I open the floor to your comments, or as a matter of fact, or on anything, any question that you have on any matter, current or past, not only related to nuclear, but to any situation today, any part in the world. So the floor is open.
Do you want me to stop sharing my screen?
You can remove the map.
Okay.
Thank you. Andrew? You're muted. You're muted.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you now, but I cannot read your lips. If you mute.
Okay. Do we know how robust the nuclear arsenal is now within the various nuclear states like the US and Russia and the UK, etc.? Like how dated have they got? How up to date are they?
I don't have. Obviously, these are confidential information, and I don't have them. What I can tell you, though, is the US has more nuclear weapons, stockpile of nuclear weapons, than Russia and China combined. Some of them, as we go along, as I said to you, since there are new weapons being built today, the most modern weapons being built today in space, or again with thanks to artificial intelligence. I'm not an expert in weapons, but that's where the emphasis goes. And as we go along, probably some of the older nuclear weapons will be destroyed by the United States, and which will keep the most modern and the delivery device, obviously, in its stockpile. But the US has, again, in terms of numbers, the US has the largest numbers of nuclear weapons, again, putting China and Russia together.
Mm-hmm.
But for deployment purposes, as I said earlier, the US, like Russia, are limited to the deployment, each of them, of 1,600 warheads, nuclear warheads, each of them. The advantage that the United States has is that within the NATO alliance, the US can deploy nuclear weapons in countries close to the Russian borders, whereas Russia does not cannot deploy nuclear weapons on the borders of the United States with Canada or Mexico, let's say. And this is also a point of contention between Russia and NATO, and that was a reason that Putin gave to invade Ukraine, because he blamed NATO and accused NATO of trying to absorb Ukraine in NATO, therefore allowing the NATO troops, and specifically American troops, allowing them to deploy nuclear weapons and missiles on the border of Ukraine with Russia. And that was the point that Putin has been making for years now, that the reason, basically, there are many reasons why he gave, and they changed, he switched reasons as we went along. But one of the reasons that he gave from the very beginning, and actually that is true, because I do remember in 2008 already, so we go back 14 years before the war started in last year. In 2008, at a security meeting in Munich, in Germany, where Putin was invited, he made a statement already to the effect that the expansion of NATO eastward was contrary to promises made by the United States in the 90s, and particularly by Secretary Baker to President Gorbachev at the time in the Soviet Union, that NATO would not expand eastward, and it would not englobe the former communist country. And that was a bone of contention, if you will, between Putin and the United States. Putin also said that assurances were given by Baker at the time, but nothing was put in writing. It was an exchange between Gorbachev and Baker at the time. And in his memoirs, Gorbachev mentioned this conversation, and that Baker made this pledge, if you will, this promise. But there is nothing was ever put in writing. So that was denied, if you will, by the American side. But so it seems anyway. So that was one of the reasons that Putin said he started the war preventively to prevent Ukraine and its government, which is pro-Western, to join NATO. Therefore, to have nuclear weapons on its soil directed at Russia, saying all the time, how would the US react if I deployed nuclear weapons on its border with Mexico or Canada? And how would it feel if the US were in my shoes and I could reach Washington in 5 minutes, whereas my warheads would take much longer to reach the US soil. But for the time being, the way it is today, indeed, that was one of the reasons, but the US has much more consequent stockpile of nuclear weapons than Russia does.
Pierre, there's
Yes.
some comments in the chat.
Okay.
There's a question in the chat.
Okay, I'm looking. Thank you. Russia keeps threatening the nuclear issue with Ukraine, etc. But do we think China can help to control that? Are we really afraid of this threat? Russia's nature is bravado and aggression, but they are not stupid. But they are the same type of threats in Poland, so it isn't just a reason to try, and recreate the Russian Empire which Putin grew up with under his KGB life. Your first question, if I understand well, is if China can help to control the Russian threats of using nuclear weapons. That's what you try. Are we really afraid of these threats? If that's your question, do we think China can help to control that? Which is, I assume, Putin's threat to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine, right? Because otherwise I don't understand what you mean by China can help to control that. To control what exactly? If you're asking me if we can count on China to control the Russian threats, as you might have seen, the Chinese president paid a 3-day visit earlier this week, from Monday to yesterday, to Moscow, and he met with Putin for 3 days. Now, everybody was assuming that the issue of Ukraine and the way to end the war would be at the center of the discussions. That probably was the case, we don't know. But in their final joint communique, there was very little mention about Ukraine and the wars there. So either the two leaders did not see eye to eye, and Putin, it shows, if you read between the lines of this statement, that Putin did not obtain everything that he wanted from China. In other words, not necessarily in terms of the nuclear issue, but in terms of just providing Russia with desperately needed weapons. That might not have happened because, again, there was nothing mentioned in the joint communique, only a moral support by the Chinese to Russia in Ukraine. And which, again, shows that China is still hesitant about a full commitment to supporting Russia, if nothing else because China is just getting out of 2.5 years of COVID. Its economy was partly affected by the COVID and the shutdown, the lockdown in China, and that China at this time is trying to relaunch, to reboot its economy. So in order to do that, first it needs to trade more and to export. And let's not forget that unlike Russia, China's economy and trade is really closely intertwined with that of the West. And they, even today, despite the differences of opinion in the Sino-American relations, China's trade with the US is booming. So China cannot afford at this time, if nothing else but for economic reasons, so domestic reasons, to help Russia and to go counter the sanctions which were imposed on other countries which are helping Russia. China cannot do that. So either this was not discussed or it was decided by the two leaders to keep it on the back burn and to talk about it at a later stage. But again, by reading the joint communique, I did not come away with the feeling that Putin obtained a military help from China. Yes, exactly point. China realizes their wealth depends on West. For the time being, very much so. And even though Xi Jinping, the Chinese president, reaffirmed his unlimited friendship, my dear friend, he called Putin, his unlimited friendship with Russia, there are limits beyond which China at the present time will not go in its support. So if that's the question that you ask me. The second one is there are the same type of threats in Poland. So it isn't just a reason to try and recreate. I was asked many times this question, whether Putin is trying to recreate the Soviet empire. And every time I was asked this question, I only could give one answer. I don't believe so. I see no advantage today for Russia, which is economically shaky, whose military is way overrated, turns out to be overrated to the point of being incompetent, because after all, they have a huge advantage in firepower and numbers. And despite that, they're facing a much smaller, despite the fact that they are facing a much smaller army with equipment which is just now being modernized as the Western, as NATO is increasing its help to Ukraine. Despite that, this war has been going on for a year now, even over a year, almost 13 months on the 24th. And Russia has not achieved any of its initial objective. The government in Kiev is still in power. The territories, additional territories, I should say, have not been annexed by Russia, except a couple of cities that Russia's offensive in the first months of the conflict took over. Today, we see that the Ukrainians are pushing back, and wherever there is fighting, the Russians do not advance. Again, despite the numbers in their favor. And so I see no advantage for Putin to open another front, whether it's Poland or whether it's the Baltic states, because he, so far, in terms of military gains, he has not made any. Crimea he occupied in 2014, and the territories that Russia annexed in December are territories that the Russian-backed militias occupied already in 2014. So no gains were made by Russia militarily in Ukraine. And as you remember, nobody expected that. Everybody expected when the war broke out that it would take maybe it won't be a walk in the park, but it will take Putin maybe 5-6 days to reach Kiev, to change the Ukrainian government, and then to pull back. And 13 months later, that has not happened. So I see no advantages for Putin. Number one, he's not sure to win attacking. And number two, as I said in my presentation, do not forget that Russia's other neighbors, unlike Ukraine, are part of NATO. So that would mean the intervention of the United States with unforeseen consequences for Putin. So no, I do not believe that he has that in mind. or whether he had that in mind when he started the war. To me, his objective was the immediate change of the Ukrainian government in Kiev, so that it would prevent Ukraine from joining the European Union, but not so much, but mostly NATO. I don't think he saw any further expansion of Russia, which again is not in a position financially, economically, or militarily to go into other countries and to occupy other countries. That would be an additional headache from which Putin probably will not recover.
I have a question,
Please.
if I may. First, thank you very much for your presentation. I enjoyed it and learned a lot. I'm wondering if you can help me understand. I know this is a really basic question, but I don't quite understand. When the Ukraine agreed to give up its nuclear arsenal, how does that actually work? I mean, what do they do? Like pull the plug? Can you help me understand what happens in that situation and how long does it take? Who's involved?
Well, basically, there are two parties involved. As you know, Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union, was one of the 15 republics of the Soviet Union. And at one time, as part of the Soviet Union, for administrative reasons, Secretary Khrushchev at the time granted Crimea to Ukraine. Crimea previously was under Soviet administration. Well, when I say Soviet, Ukraine, that was Ukraine.
Yes.
Ukraine was part of the
Soviet as well.
So it was under, for all intents and purposes, it was under Soviet administration. So again, for administrative reasons, which wasn't big deal because again, Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union, but the Russian part of Moscow decided to give Kiev administrative control over Ukraine. Now, when the Soviet Union blew up, and Ukraine became independent, like all the other ex-communist states, the Ukrainian leadership and the Russian at the time it was a Federation of Russian Republic. It wasn't the Soviet Union anymore. It was called differently because those countries which belonged to the Soviet Union, they became independent not all at once, but every republic had a different day when it became independent. So for all intents and purposes, in the beginning, it was called the Federation of Soviet Republic. The two sides sat down when Ukraine became independent, and there was an agreement between the two allies, actually, whereby Russia or the Federation gave guarantees that Ukraine would be placed under the Russian nuclear umbrella in case of an outside attack on Ukraine, for instance. But nobody ever envisioned such a scenario. And in exchange, the stockpile of nuclear warheads, which the Soviet Union had placed, stocked in Ukraine, would be returned to the Federation of Russia. So all they did was just take the bombs or the warheads, nuclear warheads, and return them to because Ukraine said, okay, even though I'm an independent state, and even though now I'm not part of the Soviet Union, I'm going to be under the nuclear umbrella of the Russian Federation. So nobody nothing changes for us, except that physically those nuclear warheads will not be on our soil. We return them to. Same thing happened with Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan also had nuclear bombs that Russia had parked in that country. And when Kazakhstan became independent, the same year, 1991, Kazakhstan returned those bombs and the stockpile of nuclear warheads to the Federation of Russian Republic. That's what happened.
Okay, thank you for explaining.
Obviously, later, when Putin took over, and mostly, particularly when there was a change in government in Ukraine, where when a pro-Western government in Ukraine took over, replaced the pro-Russian in 2003, when it took over the government in Kiev, then some issues started to pop up between Russia at the time and Ukraine. But up to 2010, 2011, Putin had no issues with Ukraine. He had issues with NATO because he saw that NATO was expanding eastward. And despite, again, alleged promises made by the US not to expand, Putin saw that slowly but surely Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, Romania, Bulgaria became NATO member states by 2004 and 2005. And this is when he started, bringing up the issue. All right, when do we stop? And the red line, he said, would be Ukraine, because Ukraine, not only they are our cousins, and he still considers the Ukrainian and the Belarusians actually as Russians. As a matter of fact, before the war, as a nation, Ukrainians did not exist as a nation. If you ask a Ukrainian, he would tell you, I'm a Ukrainian, but I'm Russian before he was Ukrainian. Same thing with Belarus. They are more than cousins. I mean, over the years, over the centuries, they mixed so much that they spoke Russian. Nobody spoke Ukrainian in Ukraine. And nobody spoke Belarusian in Belarus. Everybody spoke Russian, not only because they were part of the Soviet Union or they were constrained or forced to speak Russian, but that's the way it was. So it is only since, ironically, only since the war broke out that the Ukraine became a nation. And the people of Ukraine started to realize we are not part of Russia. We are not Russians. We became Ukrainians. And Zelensky, for instance, who spoke apparently very little Ukrainian when the war broke out, took lessons of Ukrainian to be able to address, he has a nightly program on Ukrainian television. Every night he comes on television.
Every night, huh?
Every night since the war has started.
I didn't realize that, thank you.
To the Ukrainian people and to reassure them. He plays the role of a leader of a country at war. So he's there every night. And now he speaks only Ukrainian. It's very interesting. So in a way, unwillingly, Putin created a nation next door that wasn't there only 13 months ago. It's interesting how a war can, that's a side effect of something like this that happened. They don't want to be Russians anymore.
Not surprising.
So the Russians still consider Ukrainian as part of them. It is the Ukrainians who do not consider themselves.
Right.
As a matter of fact, there are 10 million displaced people in Ukraine since the war started out. 6 or 7 of them were displaced internally. They
Mhm.
westward toward the Polish border, where there are not too many, there is no fighting. Mostly the fighting happens in the east, the south, eastern part of the country, in what you call the Donbas region, you know, Luhansk and Donetsk region. That's where the fighting near the Russian border. So some of them were displaced internally. They moved to Lviv and to other large cities in the western part of Ukraine, near the western border with Poland and Romania and Hungary. But 3 million Ukrainians moved to Russophones, went to Russia.
As many as that
But
many.
this is never mentioned in the media in the West. A couple of million of Ukrainians, Ukrainian citizens, if you will, they moved to Russia because they consider themselves, I mean, out of Ukraine has about 45 million people. Now it has 35 million people because 10 million went either abroad or they moved within Ukraine, but 2 million of them or something like that moved to Russia. Mostly from the Russian, you know, where the fighting are taking place. They want to become Russian. And in Crimea, you have a majority of Russophones and Russian population. That is why I believe that when everything is said and done and the war is over, because eventually the war will have to be over one way or the other. I don't know what the outcome of the war will be, but the war at some point will be over. Crimea will, I believe that even Zelensky somehow, even though publicly he will never admit it, but somehow I do believe that he came to realize, even grudgingly, that Crimea will stay Russian. He will not, Ukraine will not get it back. And the Western powers, particularly the United States, will never insist on Crimea returning to Ukraine. Even though, again, publicly, the US position is, it's not for us to decide the outcome of the war. It's not for us to decide the conditions under which Zelensky will speak to Putin and Putin to Zelensky, will support Ukraine in whatever decisions it makes. But deep inside, I believe that on the American side, Crimea is a done deal and will not be returned, no matter what, will not be returned to Russia, to Ukraine. And to some extent, they might be even pushing Zelensky to consider that, because in a way, if Putin is happy with just only retaining what he acquired in 2014, not now, but in this war, but in 2014, particularly Crimea, and there will be some guarantees that there is no further conflict and fighting, Ukraine will go along with it. So that remains to be seen again.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Anything else? I see that the non-proliferation issue exhausting you guys. Any other questions about any international issues or comments that you have to make? You're muted. You're muted again.
Sorry, muted again. As a separate issue altogether, what are your comments about what's going on in France at the moment?
I was surprised that nobody, I'll be honest with you, I was expecting these questions. I'm not going to launch a debate myself, but I was expecting this question, half expecting the question to come up. And I was very surprised that nobody brought it up. Well, it's not an ideal situation. I'll try to be as clear and explain it as simply as possible. Now, when President Macron was elected for his first term back in 2017, he said at that time already, when he was elected, that his major reform, if you will, of his term would be to change the retirement plan. As you know, you might not know, that today in France, people retire. Barbara, you should not listen to that because I already explained it to you in French. So you're not supposed to be listening to it once in English, once in French, because you might correct you might correct me. I didn't say that in French, so I don't want you to listen to it. So anyway, he said that the pension issue and the retirement age would be one of his major reforms of his term. As you know, or you might know, that today retirement in France is at 62. One of the last countries in Europe where it's so early, because most EU member states, Germany is 66 or 67, going on 68. Portugal, Spain is 66. Germany is 66. Italy is 64 or 65. So France is last of the Mohicans, if you will, at 62. And he said this is not possible. It's not sustainable in the long run, economically and financially speaking, because the maternity rate is very low in France. Mm-hmm. And we have fewer and fewer active people who work nowadays and who contribute to the retirement plans of the people who are retiring. Mm-hmm. Today, it's 1.6 active for one retiree, but in 2035, I think, it will be 1.2 for each retiree. So this is not sustainable. People will have to work longer in order to put more money into the pot, into the retirement. Well, needless to say, that did not sit very well with the French public opinion, but I guess it would not sit very well with any public opinion when you're asked to work 2 years more, especially in a country which has a law, as you might know, of 35 hours a week of work, generally speaking. Not for everybody, but that's what they call the French exception. So Macron said, I'm going to do that when he was elected in 2017. And he was going to do it, but then the COVID-19 pandemic struck in 2020. So he had to put it off for a couple of years, and then he came up for re-election last year. And he was re-elected. And he said, now it is really time to do it, because by 2030 or 2035, we'll have a serious issue here. We'll be running a deficit. We don't have a deficit right now, but we'll be running a deficit in the near future. So it's not sustainable. So again, the difference between the first term and the second term is that during the first term, in the French parliament, Macron had a majority of MPs, this is not the case in the current parliament. Last year, the parliament voted a fewer number of Macron's party members, and Macron has to, in order to pass legislation in France, he has to rely on a smaller conservative right party in order to pass legislation. Now, some of these people which supported him many times, this time both. And a part of these members of the parliament decided not to vote for the pension, for the retirement age, the increase of the retirement age. Another element here is that there is a law in France, if you will, a clause in the French constitution that said that if the president in France, which is elected, as you know, by referendum, I mean, it's elected by popular votes in France, by everybody. If the president cannot get a majority on vote on passing a law, there is a decree which is called 49.2, by which it's a little bit similar to what you have here, an executive order, okay? That he can run through the parliament if he believes he does not have the majority in the parliament of the members of the parliament, he can run through legislation without it being adopted by the parliament. Being unsure that these members of the right will vote for his reform, Macron chose the decree. So he ran through the parliament a law which applies to everybody in France, which is a broad law. So the French unions, the French general population, and the political opposition parties in France went up in arms. And they said to Macron, you have to listen to what the people want. You cannot only ram through such an important legislation. You cannot do it. Macron insisted, and he said, it has to be done. Thus, you have today, what you see on television today is a result of Macron's stubbornness. What he did was legal, once again. This clause number 40, decree 49.2 is written in the French constitution, and Macron can resort to it. However, the way he did it and the scope and the depth of this law, again, which applies to all French, because retirement is, applies to everybody, caused the revolt that you have today in the French population at large. And this is where we stand today. Macron came on television last night to say that he's not going to, this has to go through, and no matter what, if he has to be unpopular, so be it. Today, there were fires all over Paris, and not only in the provinces also. They're fighting with the police. And as an anecdote, which is very funny, which would be very funny if it were funny, King Charles III is paying a visit to France. He's scheduled to come to France for a state visit on Friday for a couple of days. This is his first visit to another country outside the UK. Now you can imagine he's going to see all the trash, because the trash hasn't been collected in France for the past 2 weeks. Now he's supposed to have a state dinner in Versailles on Saturday. You can imagine driving him to Versailles amongst these piles of trash and fighting in the street with the police and everything. But this is just the anecdotic part of it. The serious part of it is that nobody knows exactly how this is going to end. Some people say Macron is counting on the violence in the street of Paris to get his public opinion against the people who are protesting. So he will turn the public opinion in his favor. Other people say that he's totally out of control, and they don't know exactly how this explosion of violence and protest is going to end. Because in addition to everything else, he's not a popular figure in France. People did not vote for him, not for the first term, he was only elected twice because he was facing the right-wing candidate, who was Marine Le Pen. So people voted against Marine Le Pen. They didn't vote for Macron. He was elected, but in a way, he was elected by default, because there was nobody else but the right wing. And the French didn't want Marine Le Pen, so they voted Macron, or they stayed home. So this is where we stand today.
And she's staying very quiet.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked me these questions, because Barbara asked me this question in the French class. So I'm glad someone else asked me during this talk. Yes, Barbara, you saying?
No, I was going to ask you about Charles III and his visit. I know they're kind of biding their time as well, but they'll probably come because of all.
Because obviously canceling or postponing his visit to France again. This is his first visit. He's a big francophone actually, and francophile, Charles. He speaks fluent French, like many members of the royal family in England. He speaks fluent French. Obviously he was looking forward to his first trip. He didn't go to a country's member of a Commonwealth, for instance. He could have gone very easily to Canada. He could have gone to Australia instead of France. But no, he wanted to come to France. And to be greeted in France under these circumstances for Macron is not the best time, let's put it this way. And he might not be able to cancel it, because I mean, he would like to save face and not have to cancel such a meeting. However, the dinner in Versailles is still under some, because to have a dinner in Versailles with 200 people, and it's a state visit, so you can imagine everybody wearing a tuxedo and evening dresses and everything in the middle of what's going on in France. Public relation wise, it doesn't look good. It's like Marie Antoinette court, in the middle of the French Revolution, in a way. I'm not comparing the two, but to some extent, it would be to have such a pompous type of affair in the middle of garbage and people, protesting this reform. Just it'd be counterproductive, to put it this way. But Macron is beyond that now. I mean, he's just, I wonder how he's going to finish his term.
Well, I enjoyed I thank you, Pierre. I enjoyed the part where we discussed the Ukrainian situation. I think that came from a question of one of these. I'm hopeful that a few of the comments that you said were somewhat optimistic. I wonder, I know that Xi Jinping offered a 12-point.
Yes, he did, but
of course, Zelensky nor the United States are ready to accept that. And of course,
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was just saying, wouldn't it have been wonderful if he had made a stop, the Chinese leader in Ukraine? But
actually, he said that he's going to talk to Zelensky, not go to. And Zelensky not surprisingly, he said, I'm looking forward to talking to the Chinese leader, because Zelensky has nothing to lose, actually.
Right, absolutely.
And to some extent, I also believe that Zelensky, even though he's extremely grateful for the US support and for the Western NATO support, he would like to diversify a little bit, if that's possible at all, the type of support he might be getting. And China is absolutely very important. If nothing else, in terms of the Chinese can be helpful in moderating Putin's, tendency maybe to go all the way, or trying to calm down the Russian hardliners in Moscow. That he might be able to play that role. Now, China has not proven itself as a moderator so far with North Korea. So there is very little help that China, very little hope that China will be willing to help the United States. But we'll see.
The global world is so different. Anyway, au revoir. Merci beaucoup.
Okay, Darien, see you with the combat.
I'll see you on Monday.
On Monday.
Okay, bye. Thank you again.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much for coming, and thank you, Pierre, for an illuminating and enlightening discussion. And till the next time.
Yes, next time, pretty soon. Again, as I told you, please think about meeting in person. I'd be delighted next month if you feel like it. When you, again, for the people who might be, no, for all of you actually, please think about it. And as I said, when you sign up for it, I don't know when the flyer will be sent to you, pretty soon. I believe next week the flyers are going out, so you can see the topics of my next couple of talks. When you sign up, if you do sign up, just let know whoever is at the other end of the line or in your email that you'd like or not like to get together in person. If you don't, you don't. If you like the current format, which is online, we'll continue online. But personally, I'd be delighted to meet with you in person. Anyways, thank you very much. Enjoy your evening, and I'll hope to see you all in April. This time it won't be Russia or non-proliferation. We'll deal with China's trade bullying of its partners and how to counter it. Thank you all. Thank you, Ariel, again.
Wonderful. Thank you very much.
See you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.